Hello and welcome to The Periphery, a new podcast from the Pulaski Institution. Pulaski is a new think tank dedicated to the relationship between globalization and current issues in global politics and heartland areas. For us, that means looking at how trade and industry move through and affect places like the American Midwest and post-industrial France, but it also means trying to better understand the kinds of politics that have emerged in many of these places. Oftentimes a politics that's populist, opposed to things like international trade and foreign integration, and in many places, skeptical about democracy. We're excited to use this podcast to help add to what we can bring to the public on these topics, and really glad you've decided to come back and keep listening. Our guest today is Dr. Angie Maxwell. Angie is director of the Diane Blair Center of Southern Politics and Society at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, where she's also the holder of the Diane Blair Endowed Professorship in those areas. Angie is someone who has written extensively on politics and identity in the American South, most recently in her book, The Long Southern Strategy, which she co-authored with Todd Shields. And that book adds a lot of depth, both in terms of history and in survey data on public opinion in the South, to the traditional understanding of the Southern strategy, which is something I think a lot of us have seen as mostly being about Richard Nixon's use of race to pull away white Southerners from the Democratic Party during his campaigns in the late 60s and early 70s. So I'm really excited to get into some of the details of that and focus on the aspects I think are especially relevant to the work we're doing here at Pulaski. So welcome, Angie.
Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute thrill. I've really been looking forward to this. So I think I'll start off with just giving you a chance to lay out some of the terrain, I think. So your book explains the Southern strategy as both a more kind of elongated historical process, but it also stresses how race and racial resentment are really only one part of the way Southern politics has developed. So I'm interested, just kicking off here, if you could sort of lay out the other pillars of that long Southern strategy and how these have been utilized in American politics and life.
Absolutely. Well, I think my first kind of key to understanding that the Southern strategy really needed to be conceived of as a long Southern strategy was just realizing that after Richard Nixon, successfully capitalizes on that white racial angst after the civil rights movement to win Southern white voters over to the Republican Party, that the South turns around and goes almost completely, 10 of 11 states back to Jimmy Carter in 1976. And I thought about what we're like the day after elections and the postmortems that we do. And I thought, wow, there must have been some strategists going, well, was that a bad idea? Trying to cut into that Democratic stronghold in the South. And so I started digging, realizing, yeah, there were people saying that. It was a big debate on did they continue down that track. And so then I started looking at what was decided, which candidates helped push it, and what other issues they brought in. So in 1980, when Jimmy Carter's up for re-election, is kind of the really first test of this. And Ronald Reagan's, who had been, a candidate before in the primaries that conservatives had really pushed for, when they start looking at how do we win more Southern white voters, they polled 100,000. No, I'm sorry, they polled 40,000 American women to the cost of $100,000. And they divided them into 64 categories, these like Betty, they gave them names, Betty's, Helen's, and all of this. And they realized that there was this strong contingent of Southern white women who supported traditional gender roles and who were against the Equal Rights Amendment, which started me kind of backtracking. And when did that start? And how did that happen? And the Republican Party decides to drop the ERA from its platform in 1980. And in doing so, pulls Southern white women strongly into the fold. And that helps Reagan win the South. But then again, Bill Clinton wins back, 5 Southern states and starts to pick up ground in others. And so I started wondering, once again, what did the GOP do? And race is always there in some form. None of these are like mutually exclusive exactly. But that's when they really capitalize on trying to get evangelical fundamentalists to turn out at the polls. They did so by, putting gay marriage amendments on the ballots in certain states and just really aligning the GOP with those voters and making it part of kind of their worldly duties, right, to invest and to vote. And so it's the combination of tapping into that racial resentment, what we measure as political scientists called modern sexism, which is support for traditional gender roles and distrust of working women, and then kind of a Christian nationalism, a merger of church and state. And it takes hitting all three of those things to really, really flip the South from the top down, even to the local level. And so just like the long civil rights movement is a concept historians talk about, which makes us look backwards before, the moments of the 1960s and the marches and the things that we know, and realize the long work. It's important to realize that, undoing this Democratic stronghold in the South was a long process with a lot of infighting within the Republican Party, and one that rebranded conservatism nationally to the country at large.
I'm especially, interested in that last comment you made, because one of the takeaways I have from your book, and you use some quotes to this effect, and I think that the evidence suggests, is this idea not simply just of one party kind of coming in and trying to make inroads and then successfully flipping the region, but Southernness in a kind of Southern style in politics really making its way outward into the rest of American political life. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
There had been some historians and a journalist, even John Edgerton, who'd written back in the 80s about the Southernization of America. And that was looking more at popular culture, specifically like the spread of country music, the spread of popularity of NASCAR, but also the spread of the Southern Baptist Church towards places like the West in California. So that idea has kind of always been around. But when you look at the politics, I thought, because this book is not just about the South, right? The book was about how did Republicans, realign that particular region. But to think that they could do that as a national party and it not affect conservatives outside of the South, is kind of naive. Their focus became so singular on that base. What had started as, what if we pick off a few states, right? That gives us more options to, an electoral college victory. It turned into, wow, some of this is kind of homogenous. If we pick off a couple, we can actually pick off almost all of them. And so it became this kind of single focus dedication. And to do it wasn't just a matter of the GOP strategists picking certain issues like the ERA, prayer in schools, things like that. It was also doing it in a way that, built a bridge between Republicans and white Southerners who called themselves Southern, because the Democratic Party was part of that identity for so long. Republican Party is party of Lincoln, right? It is when you've been voting Democrat your whole life, your grandfather's life, your parents' life, right? It's something really deep. In fact, it was Ronald Reagan that said, I know what it's like, because a former Democrat, I know what it's like to be a Democrat and pull that Republican lever. He said, I promise you it only hurts for a minute, right? Like breaking that psychological stronghold took something, more powerful than just policy issues. And so the Republican Party adopted really over time a Southern style of politics, a us versus them kind of style, pit against a group, right? So if maybe you don't know what to think of us as Republicans down here, but I'll tell you what we're not, right? You want to be with that group, that out group. An absolutism, you're either for us with us or you're against us. A politics of resentment, of pitting groups against each other and zero-sum game. A lot of a big entertainment politics, big rallies, that had long been politics of entertainment, that had long been part of Southern culture. When the party does that, it rebrands itself kind of in that Southern style, and that affects the country at large, right? Because you don't live in a world anymore where you can say one message down in the South, right? And then go up to the Midwest or to the West or to New England and pivot, right? Now, increasingly, as media became more prominent and more accessible, you got to have a national kind of brand. And so it has turned that kind of modern conservatism, I have to say, to a great dismay of a lot of kind of Republicans of the past. This has not been something everyone in the party's been like, this is a great idea. There's been real infighting. But it turned it into a party that is the style. And it has become even to the point of insult politics and very much like there's no middle. Compromise is a dirty word, right? The more exaggerated, the more extreme, the more popular.
I mean, I think this is, to me, that's one of the things that made the book very compelling, is it gives a kind of actual sense of place to where some of these problems in our national politics are coming from, because so much of what you just said describes in different ways the types of conversations that are being had all across sort of political punditry and commentary areas, right? Where we're saying we have a sort of national problem now of polarization, but not just polarization, a kind of uncompromising form of polarization where it's all about the negative affect that a voter or person feels towards the other side. It's all about the idea that compromise is intolerable. There's a huge, like you said, emphasis on this kind of performance in politics, right? Which is often very much about, right, a kind of black and white narratives about us as good people kind of triumphing over other groups.
And there's an interesting reason why that's so, why was that the Southern style of politics? I mean, that's where you have to go backwards. Why was that? And for the most part, this is what we see when there is one party politics. So the famous V.O. Key political scientist who in 1949 gets a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation to go, what is going on down there, basically? And he goes state by state by state and writes the big, giant doorstop of a book called Southern Politics and State and Nation, which is the classic seminal text that launches the field of Southern politics. And V.O. Key says in a very short introduction to a book that big, that I still teach because it's so powerful, is he says, you know, one party politics creates a droll facade, a politics of entertainment, and gives the South no real political system to solve its very real problems. So when you don't have a contest of ideas between parties, when you knew it was going to be the Democrat that would win, then it becomes who's got the more outrageous story, who's the better speaker on the stump, who is the more colorful, who can have the bigger rally, right? And that became, particularly in rural areas, it became tent revival-like politics. It became a politics of how closely I identify with you, I'm one of you kind of politics. And you don't want to be with that guy, right? Kind of demonizing the other guy because they're not really talking about, well, here's my policy plan for infrastructure compared to this other guy's policy plan for infrastructure. They're not doing that because you have to have democratic control solidly, because the only time that you didn't was Reconstruction. And that's when African-American freedmen, with the help of Union troops and outsiders and some poor whites, you know, wrestled control of a lot of the state governments in the aftermath of the Civil War. And so that is not the kind of politics. What that ushered in was not what many whites wanted right after Reconstruction ended. And so they locked down a one-party system. Now, I'm not saying that generations after that were aware of that, kind of knew that in their conscious mind, but it was a really hard thing to compete for two-party competition just because of the way the system got set up after Reconstruction. And so that led to half a century, if not more, of just one party control. And that is what gave rise to that style of politics.
So something in that answer and also in your book that I think spoke to me as, we were both Southerners. I don't always sound it, but I'm a lifelong Arkansan, and it gets at this thing that it always struck me that we don't talk about for some strange reason. At least we don't. Probably that it's maybe part and parcel of some of the things we have failed to talk about when we talk about a Civil War and Jim Crow history in general, which is the current concern over the slide into potentially a less liberal democracy. I don't think the more reasonable concerns are that America is going to become illiberal overnight, but that there are sort of the edges are being sanded off in some ways of American liberal democracy, as if it's kind of come out of the blue. And growing up in this region and listening to your answer here and reading your book, it just seems very clear that so much of these things are entirely, not only are they not new, but they're very embedded, at least in this region of the country. They're historically embedded ideas and principles, this kind of lack of both in opposition to pluralism in a kind of civic society sense, and then also in the sense that there was not really real party competition, right? There wasn't really a pluralism of ideas, and a one-party system that was really just kind of dependent on where you lived in terms of how much that was used in an authoritarian way to exercise control over people. And the kind of politics you're describing, right, are the sorts of politics that emerge, right, in places where the idea that sort of competition of ideas is already not going to happen. It's a foregone conclusion that there's not a real marketplace, and not a real the kind of defining aspect of liberal democracy, that there's not a real sort of competition for political power or purchase in public life. So I'm interested in delving more into that, because this conversation in your book really help, I think, frame this as a fundamentally American, maybe if, yes, Southern, but fundamentally American problem in a way that it's much more long running than I think how often we tend to talk about the way we're facing this issue right now, just kind of as if it's arisen in the last 5 to 10 years.
Well, I mean, you have to remember that, like, if you were paying attention to politics in the 1970s, it looked like there was two-party competition. All of a sudden, the South goes red. Then all of a sudden, the South goes back to blue. Like, they were all up for grabs. They all felt purple. I mean, think about how much attention we pay right now to the states that are like on the bubble, right? Come elections. That's how it looked in the South. And you did have in every Southern state, it was happening to a different degree. It's really late in Arkansas with competition, but you were all of a sudden having Republicans and Democrats on ticket, run against each other. And so if everything that got written in that moment was hopeful from the political science side of things, of, wow, there's really two-party competition. So it's easy for me now to see it, because I'm not living in that moment. But it's not that there was really a construction of a two-party system. It's that the Republican Party just out-Southerned the Democratic Party. And people flipped parties as opposed to a real introduction of a competitive two-party system. Now, some Southern states flipped earlier, and there have been folks working very hard to build the infrastructure to challenge that. You can see that in North Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, some in Texas, and there are efforts starting in a lot of other Southern states who go, okay, we were in control for so long as Democrats. We got probably sloppy about our infrastructure and about our party's message and about just the fundamentals of how you build a successful party county by county by county. And they're trying to kind of regroup. But it wasn't that the Republican Party came in and offered competition. It kind of came in and supplanted the Democratic Party, because the National Democratic Party moved in a direction that too many white Southerners did not agree with. And so once they realized that, and that takes a very long time, starting all the way back into the 1940s, then they switched labels. Now, what we see over time is that there were Southern white Democrats that were willing to vote Republican at the national level, but they didn't change their party ID. That took time. That's where you go and look, wow, okay, they're still identifying as Democrats, but they're voting for Nixon, or they're still Democrats, but they're voting for Reagan. That's what we didn't know if it was going to hold, right? Like, is this just a momentary thing, right, at the national level? But slowly over time, the change in party identification is like a very long slope from Democrat, to Republican. And that's when you go, okay, this is something deeper, right? This isn't just one great candidate or one momentary thing. They've really gotten people to switch. And it's not that it's like a direct opposite, like people that were Democrat were Republican. It's not that there was a real competition of the two parties. That was just very hard to see when it was happening.
So you talk about this being like a supplanting and a switch, right? And I think it's interesting. You said the Republican Party out-Southerned the Democratic Party. And something you also point out, and that it feels so naturally obvious when you look back on it, right, is this fact that the success the Democrats actually had post-Nixon in the South were because they ran Southerners, right? Carter and Clinton. So I guess I'm interested in that through line, if you want to expound a little more on, as that switch is happening, and as even in the middle of it, maybe where people have this, what looks at the time like maybe a more complicated or purple political ID than they actually ended up having, as they're Democrats voting for Reagan. And then as the actual full red shift happens, what for these people is that through line of Southernness that they're identifying, that they're hooking onto? Obviously, again, for Clinton and Carter, they're from the South, but clearly part of the Republican strategy was not just running Southerners. So what is that through line of Southernness kind of defined by that these voters were attaching themselves to?
Yeah, so it's a great question about like what is kind of Southern white identity. And I say white Southern identity because there are a high percentage of African Americans who claim a Southern identity, but it means something different when we explore that. In public opinion, there's good research being done on that by people in the field right now, trying to figure it all out. But that Southern, some of those qualities were very much a distrust of outsiders, a kind of traditional values as defined by kind of white Christian, traditional gender role norms, right? State and local control of things, and kind of a least government is best government kind of viewpoint, right? That was part of that Southern identity. And it was, to some degree, white supremacy. It's at different degrees for different people. So what we start for, just to give this example, one thing we start to notice is after the civil rights movement, when you polled white Southerners and you asked them like to rate African Americans on what we call a feeling thermometer. So like, how warm do you feel to them? We start to see those numbers tick up, right? So this is a positive, all right? And it gave people a lot of optimism, like maybe, some things have changed. But then we started asking, how do you feel about whites? And we realized those numbers went up just as much. So the gap remained consistent, right? So they might be saying, oh, I feel this much warmer feelings towards African Americans, but I feel really warm feelings, by an increased similar degree to whites. And so the gap kind of remained the same. And that was something that we didn't used to measure, that we started realizing, hey, wait a second. Or racial animus shifted. Like, so we used to measure things with called old-fashioned racism. And it's just a scale. I mean, that's just the nickname for the scale. And it's just straight up, you know, Jim Crow kind of stereotypes, right, of African Americans. And how much do you rate the intelligence, the trustworthiness, the work ethic? And as we saw those numbers,
it's something as like blunt as like, do you think Black people are lazy?
Yes, that something as blunt as that. And we started to see after the civil rights movement, the number of people that would say that significantly decreased. So that seems positive. Mm-hmm. But then in the 1970s, there was an introduction of what was called the symbolic racism scale. It's now called the racial resentment scale. And it wasn't the stereotypes, but it was a belief that, you know, African Americans have gotten enough. It's time to move past race, denial of structural racism. And so it was not negative stereotypes. It was more systemic, right? And those numbers were through the roof, right? So it switched from this like personal evaluation of African-American people and their qualities, right? Which is what was being measured, to we shouldn't even be talking about race anymore. Like, there's been enough. Like, people just need to move on, right? A kind of a color blindness, but a weaponized version. And that is a deliberate kind of effort to say, okay, we've had the civil rights movement, check that box. Now we need to move on, without any real support for policies that would have created equity or even equal access to equal access to education, or to somehow, you know, level the playing field a little bit, or, you know, undo some of that structural racism. We see an immediate resistance, you know, to that. And so when we say, is it just this kind of continuous thread, right? It has changed in some ways, you know. It is positive that people give lower evaluations on these old-fashioned stereotypes. But it is not as positive as it looks when then there is just a denial of the long-term effects of those policies. Does that make sense? So that taps into this racial resentment. And so then anything the government does that's trying to help deal with that structural racism is this then seen as an attack on whites, right? And kind of reverse racism.
That seems like it really dovetails with right, Heather Cox Richardson's How the South Won the Civil War, and this idea of the emergence of this sort of equality is actually a threat to equality, right? That equality narratives and equality policies and politics are actually unjust, right? Because they threaten the social position of white men, right? And then I think that this is an interesting overlap between your book and the argument she makes, this kind of, and something I'm really interested as we're talking about, like, what defines Southern politics, right? That this kind of power structure in Southern politics that is, I think, absolutely a product of what happens when you have a one-party system, which is this sort of oligarchic, top-heavy thing where there's a lot of power concentrated in particular places. And distrust of governmental power plays an interesting role in that, to me, as an aspect of Southern identity, because there's on the one hand, particularly when it comes to things that are about redistributive justice, there's an animus towards governmental authority. But when it comes to things that are about sort of retribution, when it comes to things that have to do with the government's ability to be forceful in other cases, there's not as much discomfort, right? There's a lot of support for police power. There's a lot of support for the government authority, right?
It's selective.
So I'm interested in that because it strikes me as a fascinating through line.
Correct. So the consistent factor is, are people like me in charge and doing the things that protect people like me? When those people are not in charge, then there's a distrust of government. When those people are in charge, then there's not a distrust of government as much. Does that make sense? And that becomes more and more obvious as we get past the New Deal and we get into modern presidencies that are bigger, that do more, that have more say, that have more power. But I have to say, because I'd be remiss if I didn't, that distrust of government. And I know people, it's always tricky because I know people are not thinking this in the current moment, but the system gets built distrusting the federal government because the system that we're currently in is the system that was developed post-Reconstruction, right? Those are the constitutions that are created. And it's so important to realize what the role Reconstruction played and how things got set up, built on that distrust of government. Because Confederate officers were disenfranchised, people with property over $20,000 was confiscated, African American and Union supporters, ran governments. I mean, they held the majority of the seats in the South Carolina legislature. They held both Senate seats from Mississippi. There were over 500 African Americans elected to state legislatures, and many of whom were former slaves. So, like, if you're a white Southerner, poor white or not, the worst outcome you thought was going to happen after the Civil War, if the South were to lose, was that, these wealthy plantation owners were going to lose their property. That's the worst, right? And instead, the idea that your slaves would become your senators, never in the mindset, never, didn't even seem possible, right? Wasn't anywhere in anyone's imagination of outcomes. So when that happens, and it happens so quickly, the second that white Southern elites can get control back of the government, which happens right after 1876, is when they lock down a system in which that is never happening again, right? They concentrate the power in the hands of a few, unity in terms of their votes in national Congress. National said, we're going to be a bloc. We are not letting another party in here. We're going to squash populism. When it comes up at the turn of the century, we want no interracial coalitions. We want no class-based politics. I mean, it's built in a way as a response to what happened during Reconstruction. And that's one of the reasons it's so hard to organize. And so when the Republican Party comes in later, it's fighting that battle. It's fighting that, that memory of kind of what the Republican Party is. And so it has no option but to portray itself as somehow more Southern, right? It's going to out Southern, like I said, the Democratic Party. It isn't a real contest of ideas.
So I'm really, something you said there and that occurred to me a few moments ago when you were talking, interested in putting this framing to you and just seeing what you think, which is,
sure.
It strikes me that we can talk about both Reconstruction and the moment of civil rights victory as kind of mirror moments where you have these big reforms to Southern life and reforms that are essentially heavily enforced by the federal government that result in, at least briefly, seismic changes, right? The Reconstruction period with the end of slavery and then the 14th, 15th Amendments, that, like you said, the sudden access to all these aspects of public life for Black Americans and the very enthusiastic seizing upon that by Black Americans running for office and entering public life. And then again, after the civil rights legislation of the 50s and 60s, and not just decisions like Brown v. Board, but into the early 70s with Swan v. Mecklenburg, and essentially that some people will even say that, okay, well, true multicultural American democracy starts around the early 70s, right, where we suddenly have cemented these reforms to segregation in the Jim Crow South. And now we actually are seeing like the final realization of this process. But then there is pushback again, and all kinds of new ways of resistance. So I'm interested maybe in whether you think that's a helpful frame, even in also understanding the long Southern strategy of these kinds of mirror moments of Reconstruction, and then the sort of triumph, the moment of triumph of the civil rights era, and then what comes right after.
Yeah, I mean, there's backlash in both cases. I think there's a big difference. And the big difference is, the enforcement mechanism of Reconstruction was so extreme, right? It literally changed every white Southerner's life in a dramatic fashion. And it's in the moment of horrid grief and death and loss and people trying to make meaning out of what they've done. I mean, it is an upheaval that is unparalleled in American history of political, economic, and social systems, right? Civil rights movement is remarkable accomplishment. It is done legislatively and in the courts, but it is met with privatization in the South in many ways, and ways to get around it affecting people's everyday life. So people created bubbles in the, after Brown v. Board privatized small white flight schools, right? Or private clubs, ways to maintain their spaces they were comfortable with, so that the changes happening did not infiltrate their individual lives near the same degree as they did during Reconstruction, right? Because they're not operating from a position, they're operating from a position after the Civil Rights Movement where they have options, and they're under military occupation during Reconstruction, and half the South's burned to the ground. I mean, there are no options, right? There's no way around what's happening. So every loophole that could be found, was found. The one place where that was not available is in terms of voting rights, because there was such federal oversight. And it's the high turnout of African Americans at the ballot box that really starts to show that there is a diversity in the electorate with different viewpoints and different opinions. But the reason that there was such a backlash all the way in 2008 after Obama is elected is because there are pockets in the South by which that was seen as impossible. Places where there had never been Black leadership elected, that it was just unfathomable that that's what the world looked like if you live in this bubble where that's never been possible, right? And there are communities in the South that feel that closed, in terms of religious scholarship, we talk about it as like a sacred canopy, right? So it's like everyone's kind of under this tent and they're kind of believe the same things, see the world the same way. And even if they don't, nothing penetrates, like nothing's allowed to kind of get in. And so it makes decisions like the legalization of gay marriage by the courts, it makes Obama's election just seem radical and shocking and, oh my goodness. And that those moments are usually followed by a backlash. So I think pluralism as whoa, this is how the world works. This is what the world looks like. I still think that's being recognized. And I think that by some pockets of white Southerners for whom, that's not the way the world looks where they are.
Okay. I think that's a really interesting place to potentially move from the sort of historical frame to maybe what's going on right now. But before we do that, I want to do a quick break just to read some announcements, and then we will come back. Hey everyone, it's Alan here. I'm just cutting in to say that the Periphery from the Pulaski Institution is available on a range of podcasting platforms. Obviously, you hopefully know that if you found us here, but we're on Spotify, we're on Stitcher, we're on a few other places, we're on Amazon Music. And you can also always find us by simply going to pulaskiinstitution.org and clicking on the Periphery tab, where you can access the full archive of episodes as they come up. I'd also like to encourage you to go to the website, pulaskiinstitution.org. You'll find posts there from our fellows. You'll find news about what we're working on right now, all kinds of updates as we continue to get underway and try to really get our projects funded and kicked off. You'll find a thing we do called Headlines from the Heartlands, which is a Monday through Friday roundup of mostly local reporting from news outlets across both the American Midwest, American South, the Plains, but also other places around the world, rural Australia and north of England, places I think that people can benefit from hearing and reading about how big stories in economics and business and politics and also very local ones are playing out. So just encourage you to go to pulaskiinstitution.org where you can find all kinds of information on what we're doing and a donate button as well if you're interested in supporting the work we're trying to do. And with that, I'll like to go back to our interview with Angie. Okay, Angie, you said here at the end, we were talking about pluralism and the kind of reaction to Barack Obama. So I think I'm interested now in just turning to the moment we're in right now and how much I think this whole conversation relates to what's going on right now. Because a lot of people are talking, I think, in very shocked tones about the willingness of politicians to engage in deceptions about election results, to use governmental positions to create distrust, right, in government. The audits we're seeing in states across the country, and for what it's worth to me, to retain the framing of a lot of the work you've done, it strikes me as really, if you've grown up in the South, we've only really had this brief 40, 50-year reprieve where elections were genuinely open and fair and driven by, at minimum, those pluralistic values, even if they didn't always deliver those outcomes. So I think I'm interested in having you respond a little to just what you see as some of the ways that this is perhaps also a long event, right? I think a lot of people are treating it as a new phenomenon. So how can we put that long framing on the kind of big lie challenge that's being put forward in American politics?
That's a great question. So there's some of it that's new and there's some of it that's not, right? Truth's kind of always somewhere in the middle. And I think that it's deeper than just the election is a fraud, right? So, but let me start with that part. So the idea that elections are somehow rigged, right? Or that elections are not fair, there's voter fraud and all that kind of stuff. I mean, this is, psychologically analyzing an entire, group of people, which is risky. So I'm saying it only as to be thought provoking, to have people think. But when you are setting up a system that includes poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, understanding clauses, all white primaries, a million different ways to somehow restrict African Americans from voting and get around the 15th Amendment and the, 19th Amendment, then you are conscious of the fact that elections can be manipulated, now, or access to the ballot at least can be manipulated, right? You also have to remember that part of the reason that Reconstruction ends and the troops are removed from the South is because there were 3 Southern states in the 1876 election whose electors were contested. Those states had gone Democrat, and there were Union troops and election overseers who said, there was intimidation at the ballots. African Americans were not allowed to vote. These are not legitimate. Those states were South Carolina, Louisiana, and of course, because it always is, Florida, right? And they actually didn't contest. The Democrats who said they'd won gave up the fight there as a trade-off for, we'll let these states go Republican. The Republican will win again. Rutherford B. Hayes, our Democratic candidate, Samuel Tilden, will lose. But if Hayes will agree to pull the troops out and end military occupation. So they've traded electors, in history for something like that. I mean, yes, it's a long time ago. And then within the Republican Party, one of the things that gives rise to the early kind of pre-Nixon conservative faction that supports Goldwater is feeling that Dwight D. Eisenhower steals the nomination at the Republican conventions in the 50s. They are angry, conservative Republicans, many of whom in the Midwest, feeling like there was, games played at that convention. We used to actually select the candidate at the convention, that there were last minute games played and their candidate in Ohio was robbed, and there's a mass conspiracy theory by elite Republicans. That was, and literally they write books about this elite conspiracy within the Republican Party. So the wing of the Republican Party that comes trying to find common, ground with white Southern Democrats and build something big enough to take over their party is already basing it on a feeling like elections are stolen from the very beginning. You add to that the controversies over the 2000 election, and you can see how, and you have African-American communities talking for generations about the continuation of voter disenfranchisement and intimidation and, manipulation even after the Voting Rights Act. And so that language is getting co-opted. Well, you've been saying there's election rigging, all of these years. And you add that to the conspiratorial bent that started this wing of the party in the first place. You add that to a long history of, manipulating who can vote. And it's not that far reaching to think elections can't be somehow affected, right, by human beings, right, who are in charge. But what I think is the deeper issue that's being applied to this is a demonization of the Democratic Party, right, as a way to build Republican support. Now, I'm not saying Democrats don't do it to some degree too, right? But one of the ways that the Republican Party made inroads in the South with these Southern Democrats is to throw shade at the National Democratic Party. Oh, they're going to throw you under the bus. They are absolutely going to go hog wild on civil rights enforcement. Like they are leaving you. They are telling you what you want to hear. Kennedy is telling you what you want to hear, but this is what he's going to do. LBJ is telling you what you want to hear, but this is what he's going to do. Bill Clinton is telling you what you want to hear, but this is what he's going to do. And that they're crooks and liars. And so there is it's not enough just to think that people could go, well, elections could be sketchy. It is that they believe that the other party would absolutely rig it, steal it, manipulate it, and have a mass media cover-up. And that comes from what George Wallace used to do, which was called positive polarization. If you're trying to win someone over who's sketchy of you, demonize the them so they want to be part of your us, right? Which George Wallace was great at. He said, who was the segregationist governor of Alabama, who ran in the 60s also. But one thing that the GOP kind of copied from him in later cycles was his ability to do that, his ability to get people who kind of thought Wallace was a little like, I don't know, schwarmy and like, you know, uncouth and just kind of rough around the edges and kind of corrupt. But he'd go, are you one of these liberal pinhead agitator, hippie, long hair? I can't tell if you're a boy or a girl. You're that. And people were like, well, I'm not that. Right. So he made them choose. And, you know, the Republican candidates that have been successful nationally, not all of them have done this, but the ones who have been successful nationally have done some of that, have so tried to build, here's our us, by saying, don't be them. And the demonization of that them is a big part of the polarization. And exaggerating what that them will do to you if they're in charge, what they're going to do to you, how they're going to ruin your, life. And that it's not a far jump then to think they'd rig an election, right? That party would do that. So it's not just a distrust in elections as a system. That's how evil the other side is.
So something in all of this you're talking about, I think we've been dancing around for some time, that I want to get at here is before we were done, which is the Republican Party itself. You mentioned that there were significant numbers of Republicans who were uncomfortable with the Southern strategy. You also touched on the kind of earlier divisions between the sort of Eisenhower and Nixonite type Republicans. And then I think even now we see I think it's important to note that it's very small, but a substantive pushback from some Republicans like Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger in the current moment. And so I'm interested in you just teasing out a little bit that internal party. Yes, there's been the Republicans versus the Democrats, but this internal fight and how it's played out a little bit within the GOP and the decisions that have been made over the last few decades.
Well, there was if you look at the party platforms of Republicans and Democrats on things like civil rights in the 1950s, they're almost identical. They almost match. There was a lot of what we call Rockefeller Republicans, which were kind of, now who knows how far they would have gone, but they were considered kind of pro-civil rights Republicans.
Ironically, Arkansas home to
absolutely. Absolutely. Went through Rockefeller, who brings that here, which is one of the reasons Arkansas flipped slate, because the Republican Party is not started as an anti-civil rights party here, or a pushback in that sense. But also the Republican Party is the first party that puts the equal rights movement in their platform. I mean, Republican feminists are absolutely devastated when the party turns on the ERA, devastated. And they were not all evangelical, religious, Republicans, I mean, Bob Dole, they were like, you got to go talk to Southern Baptist Convention. He's like, I don't want to, they had to make him. He's like, I don't want to panhandle these folks. Even Goldwater late in his career was like, when he saw the Republican Party doing that, was like, that's a mistake. Not everyone agreed. Right. Now, over the course of 50 years, most people have sorted themselves accordingly. So what we see is there are people that, like most of those Republican feminists, left the party eventually. They didn't do it right away, but they left eventually. So there is still a small faction within the Republican Party that, and I guess I would say this, if your local or your state Republican Party wasn't so extreme, then people had a reason to still maybe be in it, even if they're like, I don't like where the National's going, right? But you don't have a lot of Southern Republicans, self-identified, call themselves Republicans, that are hardcore feminists, pro-civil rights, or pro-separation of church and state. There are some, they're business conservatives. That is increasingly being made a very hard place to exist, right? I think that's why you see some of the pushback is not from Republican Southerners. It's from people like Liz Cheney, who have a longer history and a longer view, or Mitt Romney, who are trying to maybe say, let's rescue the party, right? But it's a hard place for a moderate Republican to exist right now, and Trump made it a lot worse. I mean, you have to remember that prior to Trump, I mean, who are the nominees? It's Romney and McCain. I mean, it was that recent. It was that recent that it was people we now consider very moderate Republicans, right? So of course there's people holding on to that thinking, can we get past the Trump thing and get back to where we were? Because it's so recent.
People who we consider moderate, right? But Mitt Romney, even if we would actually consider 2012 Mitt Romney a moderate, describing himself as severely conservative.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think that tension is fascinating as well.
Changed. It has shifted, but the Tea Party was moving in that direction anyway. I mean, there was definitely a wing. George W. Bush was talking about amnesty for immigrants. I mean, there was it was much more center right. It was much more center right. And that's how the Republican Party was under, in the 50s. It was much more center right. Then a far right wing pulled it. And then it seemed like it started to maybe start to come back a little bit. And now it's been pulled again. And will people hang on, right? A lot of them didn't make the first jump. Will they hang on past this one? I will say that national parties move. I mean, the Democratic Party moved. It moved dramatically from the party that was, dominated by Southern slaveholders, right? I mean, national brands and parties kind of move. It's the fact that we get so stuck to those brands nationally that is, part of our problem.
Do you think you can, before I turn to our last in question, do you think you can hang for a minute or two after the recording? I had a couple things I wanted to ask.
Sure.
It's cool. Well, as we end here, I'm going to ask you what I ask everyone, which is, Pulaski is dedicated to these heartland areas, and certainly part of the way we talk about them is left behind to a degree. And so one of the things I'm always interested in is asking a guest, whether it's where you currently live or a place you've lived in the past or are from, somewhere you think that if someone made it to that sort of neck of the woods is criminally underrated, that they should really go out and experience and see.
Oh, it's such a good question. And I hesitate to say it because I don't know. I don't know if it's underrated anymore. It tends to get really high rankings now. But, there's this, as someone who is from South Louisiana, where everything is pretty flat, right? I'll never get over that moment when you come upon Fayetteville. It used to be definitely up the pig trail connecting over, but also on, I-49, and there's just nothing and nothing. It's beautiful, right? And that was mountains to me. There's no billboards. It's all been protected and preserved in that sense. And then all of a sudden you kind of turn this corner and there's this little town situated between the mountains, and you see the towers of Omain, and it just looks like it was just kind of dropped right there. And I fell in love with it the first time I visited. And I think that despite people saying it's kind of quality of life and, it's high rankings now, I still think it's underappreciated for being a magical blend of, environmental, smart policies and a fierce independence that I love about the Ozarks and about Arkansas in general. And the diversity, not just of racial and ethnic backgrounds, which is increasing, but is still, still small, but in thought and beliefs about, how to build this state. And so I guess it's still to this day, that little view when you come over that hill and you see the city in a distance, it just seemed like a magical place where people had a chance to do something. So, and it has been that for me.
Oh man. I mean, I know this is not the kind of thing where you crown a winner, but you're speaking to my soul. I mean, Arkansas is, I think so many people are surprised by our mountains.
Arkansas underestimates itself.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very, very special place.
Yeah.
It's a very, very special place. And the people of Arkansas are special people. And they have given me chance after chance after chance and taken chances on me as an outsider and welcomed me and in ways that don't always happen in other places. And so it has my loyalty in, forever.
Same. And, on that note, I guess before just have to add that the Arkansas Razorbacks are the number 8 football team in the nation right now. So woo pig, if anybody else is listening to.
Razorback women's soccer is on a streak too.
And yeah, Arkansas sports in general, having a really
great.
a year. So thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for joining us. The Periphery is a production of the Pulaski Institution. I've been your host, Alan Elrod. Our music was written, recorded, and produced by Brandon Ragsdale and Cody Smith. Thank you for coming, and please join us next time.